Despised by the entire village, a boy with different colored eyes carries the stigma of being cursed. In the most devastating drought ever seen, he discovers water by following ants, but is accused of witchcraft. A wise old man recognizes divine signs in him as miracles begin to happen. Amidst persecutions and ancient prophecies, his journey will reveal a greater purpose, a story of redemption and faith that will touch your heart. Subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. The midwife's cry pierced the pre-dawn. Silence like a grim omen. Her trembling hands almost let the newborn slip when the light of the oil lamp revealed what no one expected to see. One eye blue as the clearest sky and the other brown as freshly tilled earth. In the small village of Stone Creek, where superstitions were cultivated with more zeal than the crops themselves, there was no clearer sign of a curse. "Hide this creature. Don't let it bring more misfortune upon us," shrieked the old woman, making the sign of the cross repeatedly. The mother, exhausted by the difficult birth, merely wept in silence while the father, Tobias, stared at his son with a mix of shame and fear that would never completely leave his gaze. The years dragged on like the clouds that rarely brought rain to that region. Ezekiel, a name chosen not out of love but because it meant God will strengthen, in a desperate hope for divine protection, grew up in the shadows of his own home. His bed was a gnarled wooden cot covered with straw that itched his skin during the cold nights, while his siblings slept on wool mattresses. At meals he watched hungrily as the others served themselves, only to then receive the leftovers scraped from the bottom of the earthenware pots. By age 5, he was already working the parched fields, pulling weeds that seemed to be the only plants willing to defy the aridity of that land. The other children formed an invisible wall around him. When he approached, they scattered like frightened birds. The adults, in turn, murmured prayers and made warding gestures, as if the boy's mere gaze could contaminate their souls with some unknown evil. "Why do they hate me so much, Mother?" he asked one day, returning from the fields with hands bleeding from excessive labor. His mother, Martha, felt her heart ache. Deep down, she loved this strange son, but the fear of others' judgment outweighed her courage to show affection. "It's not hate, Ezekiel. It's fear of what they don't understand. Your eyes, they're different, and people fear what is different. But I didn't choose to be this way," the boy replied with a wisdom that transcended his young age. Martha merely nodded, unable to offer more comfort than a brief caress of his dark hair when no one was looking. What no one noticed, however, was that this seemingly cursed child possessed extraordinary gifts that flourished silently, like rare flowers blooming in the most unlikely places. Ezekiel developed a resilience that would make gnarled trees envious. His kindness remained intact, despite the stones of rejection thrown daily against his soul. And even more surprisingly, he nurtured an inexplicable connection with nature. He could predict changes in the weather by observing the flight of birds. He knew when the goats would give birth just by the shine in their eyes, and he understood the patterns of ants as if they whispered ancient secrets to him in a language only he understood. At night, lying on his makeshift bed, Ezekiel gazed at the stars through the gaps in the thatched roof and spoke to them in silence. "Is there a place for me in this world? A place where I am not a mistake, an aberration, a stain on the perfect tapestry others imagine life should be?" When the stars shone back, silent witnesses to a pain few would understand. That year's spring fled like a broken promise, and summer descended upon Stone Creek with relentless fury. The sun, like a vengeful god, scorched the already parched land. 6 months passed without a drop of rain. The wells began to dry up one after another. First, the communal well in the central square. Then, the private wells of the wealthier families. Finally, even the stream that meandered along the village outskirts dwindled to a mere dried-up scar on the landscape. Ezekiel, now 12 years old, watched with growing concern as the crops withered and the cattle grew thin. Sitting under the shade of a gnarled olive tree, the only one still bravely resisting the drought, he noticed something strange in the behavior of the ants. Instead of following a straight line as usual, they formed a spiral pattern, converging on a specific spot on the stony ground. "What did you find?" he murmured, following the hypnotic movement of the tiny insects. Driven by an intuition he didn't fully grasp, Ezekiel began to dig at the spot with a dry branch. The surface soil was hard as stone, but as he went deeper, it became strangely moist. After an hour of stubborn work, when his fingers were already bleeding from the effort, he felt fresh water wet his hands. "Water! I found water!" he cried, momentarily forgetting his outcast status. Some people passing by approached with suspicion. Upon seeing the small pool that began to form, the news spread through the village like wildfire. Soon, a crowd gathered around the boy. "How did you know there was water here?" "No one has ever dug in this spot," questioned the village chief, a corpulent man named Jerome, whose wrinkled face had never shown any sympathy for Ezekiel. "The ants. They showed me the way," the boy replied simply. A murmur of astonishment and fear rippled through the crowd. An elderly woman knelt, making the sign of the cross repeatedly. "Witchcraft! He consults insects! This is the work of the devil!" she shrieked, pointing a bony finger at Ezekiel. "No, it's not witchcraft!" the boy protested, recoiling from the hostile expressions surrounding him. "I just observed the ants and—" "Silence!" thundered Jerome. "First the cursed eyes, now this. Perhaps we should drive him out once and for all before he brings more misfortune." The crowd began to advance threateningly when an aged but firm voice rose above the murmur. "Stop! Don't you see what's happening here?" It was Samuel, the oldest farmer in the village. At 70 years old, with hair white as snow and a beard reaching his chest, he was respected for his wisdom gained through the many droughts and storms he had witnessed throughout his life. He was also the only one who could read the sacred texts kept in the small stone chapel. "This boy has just saved us all from thirst. And you reward him with threats?" he continued, making his way through the villagers until he reached Ezekiel. The ancients spoke of those who see beyond the visible, who understand the signs of nature when all others are blind. Perhaps we should give thanks instead of condemning. The respect Samuel inspired caused the crowd to hesitate. Jerome, however, was not so easily convinced. "And what about his eyes? Is that also a divine sign, old Samuel? Or do you prefer to ignore the obvious?" Samuel gazed deeply into Ezekiel's heterochromatic eyes, as if he could read his soul through them. "He who sees with the eyes of earth and sky shall unite what was divided," he recited, with a solemn tone that silenced even the village chief. "It is written in the ancient texts for those with the wisdom to interpret." The tension was palpable, and for a moment it seemed the situation could descend into violence. But thirst was more urgent than fear. The village needed that water. Finally, Jerome backed down, although his eyes promised that the matter was not settled. "We will dig here. If we find more water, the boy will be spared. For now," he decreed, walking away with heavy steps. In the days that followed, the well discovered by Ezekiel proved to be a generous source, saving the village from imminent thirst. However, instead of gratitude, the boy felt the weight of suspicious stares every time he approached to drink. Many refused to use the water when he was nearby, preferring to wait for him to leave. Samuel, however, sought him out discreetly at dusk on the third day. "You have a gift, son, a gift few will understand, but one that can make the difference between life and death in these difficult times." "A gift?" Ezekiel repeated, incredulous. "Everyone says I'm cursed. It's easier to fear the extraordinary than to understand it," the old man replied with an enigmatic smile. "Come to my hut after sunset. There are things I need to show you." That night, under the flickering light of an oil lamp, Samuel revealed to Ezekiel a world he had never imagined existed. From a carved wooden chest, he extracted parchments yellowed with age, covered with writings in an ancient language. "These are sacred texts preserved for generations. They speak of prophecies and signs, of chosen ones and trials," he explained, carefully unrolling one of the parchments. "And they also speak of a boy with eyes that reflect the sky and the earth, destined to renew the covenant with the divine in times of great need." Ezekiel touched the parchment with trembling fingers, feeling a strange familiarity with those symbols he couldn't decipher. "Do you really believe that it's me? I believe there is a purpose for you being here now, in this place, and that Your different eyes are not a curse but a sign for those who know how to see. Thus began an improbable friendship between the old farmer and the young outcast. Every night, hidden from others' view, Ezekiel learned to read the ancient texts and understand the signs of nature under Samuel's patient guidance. It was as if an entire world opened before him, a world where being different was not a cause for shame but perhaps part of a greater design. The drought, however, continued to relentlessly plague the region. Even with the new well, the situation was critical. The crops dwindled under the merciless sun, and the specter of hunger began to stalk the village like a hungry wolf. And then, as if the trials weren't enough, a new threat appeared on the horizon, a dark cloud approaching rapidly. "Locusts!" cried the first farmer who spotted the swarm. Thousands of them. Panic spread like wildfire. Everyone knew what that meant. If there was already little to harvest, now nothing would remain. It would be the end of Stone Creek. That night, the village prepared for the worst. Ezekiel had a vivid dream. He saw small birds with colorful plumage descending from the heavens in large flocks, devouring the locusts before they could destroy the crops. Upon waking, he knew immediately what he needed to do. "We need to build perches," he announced to Samuel the next day. "Tall perches around the fields." The old farmer watched with curiosity. "Perches for what?" "For the birds. They will come. I know they will come. I saw it in my dream. But they need a place to land." Samuel did not question him. After months of living with Ezekiel, he had learned to trust the boy's intuitions, which were rarely wrong. Together, they began to build simple structures with dry branches and ropes. Soon, some villagers noticed the activity and approached with expressions of distrust. "What are you doing?" a woman asked, keeping a safe distance from Ezekiel. "Preparing." "For the locusts," Samuel replied calmly. Ezekiel had a vision. "Birds will come to help us, but we need to build places for them to land." The reactions were predictable. Some laughed openly, others shook their heads in disbelief. Some, however, hesitated. "What if he's right?" murmured a young mother, whose small child depended on the next harvest to survive the winter. "What do we have to lose?" Slowly, a small group formed around Samuel and Ezekiel. It wasn't acceptance. Far from it. But despair sometimes opens doors that prejudice keeps shut. By the end of the day, dozens of simple perches had been erected at strategic points around the fields. Jerome watched everything from afar, his face contorted in a mask of disapproval. His influence as village chief had been gradually waning since the well incident. Each small success of Ezekiel was a threat to his power, built on fear and superstition. Days passed in tense anticipation. The locusts approached ever closer, and there was no sign of the promised birds. Some of those who had helped began to regret, murmuring they had been foolish to believe the cursed boy. On the morning of the third day, Ezekiel awoke before dawn, a strong premonition pulsing in his chest. He ran to the nearest field and waited, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, where the first light of day began to tint the sky pink and gold. And then, as if in answer to his silent prayers, they appeared. First, just a few dark specks in the dew sky, then dozens, hundreds. Small birds with iridescent plumage, like none the inhabitants of Stone Creek had ever seen before. They came in formation, like an organized army, and began to land exactly on the perches that had been built. "They came," Ezekiel cried, tears of relief streaming down his young face. Exactly like in the dream. The villagers began to gather, watching open-mouthed the unusual spectacle. The birds remained on the perches just long enough to rest. Soon they took flight again, but not to leave. Instead, they launched themselves like living arrows against the cloud of locusts that was approaching, devouring them by the thousands. The battle lasted all day. By dusk, there wasn't a single live locust near the village. The crops, although already damaged by the drought, had been saved from total destruction. "It's a miracle," the villagers whispered, looking alternately at the birds that now rested, again on the perches and at the boy with different eyes who had summoned them. For Ezekiel, that moment represented a transformation. For the first time in his 12 years of life, He received looks that were not of fear or contempt. There was admiration there, perhaps even gratitude. It was as if an invisible weight had been partially lifted from his shoulders. However, this first victory brought with it new challenges. In the days that followed, some villagers began to seek him out discreetly, asking for advice about crops or the weather, trying to take advantage of his special connection with nature. Others, however, led by Jerome, intensified the harassment. The village chief could not accept that his authority was undermined by a boy he had always considered an aberration. Malicious whispers multiplied. He can control animals. What other hidden power does he possess? Maybe he caused the drought, himself only to then present himself as a savior. Ezekiel now lived torn between the genuine desire to help those who were beginning to trust him and the fear of the consequences. Each small gesture of kindness on his part was interpreted in radically opposite ways, as a divine blessing by some, as a demonic trick by others. Samuel observed this dynamic with growing concern. The old farmer knew that his own influence over the community was the only effective protection Ezekiel possessed. And he also knew, although he tried to hide it from the boy, that his time was limited. A persistent cough had settled in his chest months ago, and the blood that occasionally stained his handkerchief revealed the severity of his condition. When the time came for the harvest festival, a tradition traditionally held even in the most difficult years, Samuel felt it was time to reveal certain secrets he had kept to the boy. The night of the celebration was always special in Stone Creek. Bonfires were lit in the central square, ancient songs were sung, and for a few hours the weight of daily hardships seemed lighter. Even in that year of extreme scarcity, the villagers made an effort to keep the spirit of tradition alive. Ezekiel watched everything from a distance, as he always had. Despite his recent rise in some people's esteem, he still didn't feel truly part of the community. It was then that he noticed Samuel staggering in the shadows, away from the light of the bonfires. "Master," he exclaimed, running to support the old man before he fell. "What happened?" Samuel coughed violently, and Ezekiel saw with horror the blood that stained his parched lips. "My time is running out, son," the old man murmured, when he managed to control the cough. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've kept for a long time." With Ezekiel's help, Samuel managed to reach his hut. Inside, by the flickering light of a candle, his appearance was even more fragile and gaunt. "It wasn't by chance that I took you under my protection," he revealed between coughing fits. 15 years ago, even before you were born, I had a dream so vivid it seemed more real than reality itself. I saw a boy with eyes that reflected the sky and the earth, bringing life to the desert. And I heard a voice that told me, "Protect him, teach him, for through him the promise will be renewed." Ezekiel listened in reverent silence, his heart pounding. "When you were born and the rumors about your eyes spread, I knew immediately it was you, the boy from my dream." Samuel paused, breathing with difficulty. "But I was afraid of being wrong, afraid of what might happen if I shared my vision prematurely. So I waited. I watched until the incident with the well gave me the certainty I needed." With trembling hands, the old man opened a small carved wooden chest he kept near his bed. From inside, he took out an object wrapped in a faded cloth. "This map," he said, carefully unrolling a piece of goatskin covered with seemingly meaningless symbols and lines, "shows the way to a sacred place in the mountains. A place where, according to the ancient scriptures, the sky touches the earth and the secrets of rebirth are revealed." Ezekiel stared at the map, trying to understand its meaning. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because your destiny isn't in Stone Creek, my son. This village is just the beginning of your journey. When I am gone, you will no longer have protection here. And there is knowledge in the mountains, knowledge about special seeds mentioned in the ancient texts, guarded by the cave dwellers, that can transform this entire region." Samuel was interrupted by another coughing fit, more violent than the previous ones. When he finally calmed down, there was an urgency in his eyes that Ezekiel had never seen before. "Promise me that, when the time comes, you will follow this map. Promise me you won't give up no matter how difficult the path. "I promise," Ezekiel replied, feeling the weight of those words on his young soul. "But how will I know when it's time?" "You will know," Samuel murmured, closing his exhausted eyes. "The signs will show you the way, as they always have." The old farmer fell asleep soon after, his irregular breathing worrying Ezekiel, who watched over his sleep until dawn. When the first rays of sun penetrated the gaps in the hut, Samuel seemed a little stronger, but both knew the improvement was temporary. In the days that followed, Ezekiel divided his time between caring for Samuel and fulfilling his obligations in the fields. His relationship with the other villagers remained ambivalent. Some treated him with a new hesitant respect. Others maintained their usual hostility. It was during this period of uncertainty that an incident occurred that would forever change the course of his story. An unexpected storm descended upon Stone Creek one afternoon from a seemingly clear sky. It wasn't the beneficial rain everyone had longed for months, but an elemental fury of howling winds and lightning that tore the sky like flaming swords. The villagers ran to their homes, seeking shelter from the sudden violence of the elements. Ezekiel, who was in the fields when the storm began, hurried back to the village, concerned about Samuel's fragile health. It was then that he heard a cry for help almost muffled by the roar of the wind. Following the sound, he found a terrifying Jair, Jerome's 11-year-old son, was trapped under a heavy cart that had overturned in the force of the wind. The boy screamed in pain, his arm visibly broken, while the torrential rain was beginning to form a current that threatened to drag him along with the cart into a nearby embankment. Without a second thought, Ezekiel ran to help him. The water was already up to his knees when he reached the cart. With a superhuman effort, he managed to lift the cart slightly, enough for Jair to crawl out. "Hold on to me!" he shouted above the roar of the storm, and practically carried the injured boy to higher ground. When they finally reached safety, Ezekiel realized they weren't alone. Jerome and some other villagers had witnessed the entire rescue, watching open-mouthed the courage of the boy they had always despised. The village chief's face was an indescribable mask of conflicting emotions: relief for his son's survival, perplexity at Ezekiel's courage, and an unmistakable discomfort at now owing his heir's life to the cursed boy. You saved my son," he finally said, the words coming out as if each one cost him immense effort. "Anyone would have done the same," Ezekiel replied simply. But they both knew it wasn't true. No one else had risked themselves in that furious current to save Jair. Everyone else had fled, seeking their own safety. In the days that followed, the village became even more deeply divided. Jair's family, including his mother and siblings, showed genuine gratitude to Ezekiel. Others, impressed by his act of courage, began to question if someone truly cursed would be capable of such altruism. Jerome, however, seemed more bitter than ever. His authority, already shaken by recent events, now suffered from the undeniable fact that he owed his son's life to someone he had always treated as inferior. A debt of gratitude was an unbearable burden for a man like him. 2 weeks after the ideal storm incident, Jerome convened a meeting of the village council, a group composed of the oldest and most respected men in the community. Ezekiel was not invited, but Samuel, despite his deteriorating health, insisted on attending. The decision announced the next day landed like a punch to the gut for Ezekiel. He should leave the village after the next full moon. "It's for your good," Jerome explained before the entire community gathered in the central square. "There are those who still consider you an undesirable presence. We cannot guarantee your safety indefinitely." The words sounded almost reasonable, even concerned, but Samuel and Ezekiel immediately understood the true underlying message. Jerome was expelling him, but in a way that made him seem benevolent, in the eyes of those who now sympathized with the boy. That night, alone in his dark corner of the family hut, Ezekiel allowed the tears to flow freely. Despite all the hardships, Stone Creek was the only home he had ever known. Leaving it meant stepping into the unknown, without the guidance of Samuel, whose health worsened each day. It was in this moment of deep desolation that an idea began to form in his mind. The traditional fasting period that preceded planting Season was about to begin. It was an ancient ritual in which the farmers abstained from food for 3 days to purify their bodies and souls before entrusting the precious seeds to the earth. Ezekiel decided to participate in the fast, something he had never done before as he was not considered a full member of the community. No one could deny him this right, especially after saving Jair. On the 3rd day of fasting, exhausted and weakened by hunger, Ezekiel had a vision so vivid he felt he could touch it. He saw green fields where today only parched land existed. He saw trees laden with fruit that had never grown in that region. And, clearer than anything, he saw seeds, small, bright, almost luminous, being planted by wrinkled hands in the moist earth. When the vision ended, Ezekiel knew with absolute certainty what he needed to do. The special seeds mentioned in the ancient texts, guarded by the cave dwellers in the distant mountains, were the key to the transformation of the entire region. And the map Samuel had given him showed the way. With a determination only the eye had truly desperate know, Ezekiel made his decision. He would leave even before the next full moon in search of those miraculous seeds. If he succeeded, he would return not as a pariah begging for acceptance, but as someone who brought a gift capable of changing everyone's destiny. On the eve of his departure, he visited Samuel one last time. The old man was extremely weak, but his eyes lit up upon hearing the boy's plans. "You understood," he murmured with a weak smile. "The vision, the seeds, it's exactly as it's written in the sacred texts." "I fear I'm not ready," Ezekiel confessed. "What if I fail? What if I don't find the way?" "You have never been alone on your journey, my son. The same signs that have guided you so far will continue to show you the way." Samuel instructed him about the dangers of crossing the desert, how to navigate by the stars, and how to find water in seemingly dry places. When they finally said their goodbyes, the old man placed his trembling hands on Ezekiel's head in a gesture of blessing. 40 days, he said. This is the sacred time for the journey. No more, no less. In 40 days you must return, with her, without the seeds. The following dawn, before the village woke, Ezekiel left. He carried with him only a water skin, barley bread, and the map drawn on goatskin. At the last moment, his mother, who had always loved him in silence, fearing to show affection openly, secretly gave him a family medallion. It belonged to my grandmother, and her grandmother before that, she explained with tears in her eyes. They say it protects travelers and guides the lost back home. It was the first time Martha showed her love so openly, and Ezekiel felt his heart swell with emotion as he hung the medallion around his neck. I will return, Mother, I promise. And so, with his heart divided between fear and hope, Ezekiel left Stone Creek, heading towards the distant mountains that rose like bluish sentinels on the eastern horizon. The first days of the journey were relatively easy, as he followed routes known by the region's shepherds. But as he advanced eastward, the landscape became increasingly arid and desolate. The relentless sun was his constant companion, scorching his young skin despite the cloak he wore for protection. On the 10th day, when the mountains still seemed as distant as on the first day, the water in his water skin ran out. Thirst became a growing torture, drying his lips and clouding his thoughts. For the first time since the beginning of the journey, Ezekiel considered the possibility of failure. Maybe I was foolish to believe, he murmured to himself as he dragged himself over the endless dunes. Maybe it's all just the dreams of a dying old man and a boy desperate for acceptance. It was then, almost delirious with thirst, that he spotted a small insect, a solitary ant, crossing the sand before him. He immediately remembered how he had found water following the ants in Stone Creek. A sign, he whispered, hope renewing in his exhausted chest. With effort, he followed the tiny insect for almost an hour, until, incredibly, the landscape began to change. Tufts of sparse vegetation appeared, then increasingly dense bushes, and finally, like a vision of paradise, a small oasis revealed itself between two dunes. Palm trees surrounded a small lake of crystal-clear water, reflecting the sky like a perfect mirror. Ezekiel fell to his knees on the shore and drank greedily, tears of gratitude mixing with the fresh water. It was in this oasis, not marked on his map, that Ezekiel met Esther, a shepherd girl roughly his age, whose large dark eyes seemed to hold all the wisdom of the desert. Esther's community had been dispersed by hostile nomads, and she had been wandering alone for months, surviving thanks to her deep knowledge of the region. "Where are you going with such determination, boy with different eyes?" she asked, watching him curiously as he consulted Samuel's map. Ezekiel hesitated only for a moment before sharing his story and his mission. To his surprise, Esther didn't show fear or distrust upon seeing his heterochromatic eyes. Instead, she nodded as if she had just had a suspicion confirmed. "In my tribe, there are stories about people like you," she said simply. "People who carry the mark of the horizon in their eyes, destined to unite what was separated." A wave of emotion ran through Ezekiel upon hearing these words. His entire life, his eyes had been a source of shame and rejection. Finding someone who saw them as a positive sign, even special, was an unprecedented experience. "I know these mountains well," Esther continued. "I can guide you there if you allow me to accompany you." And so, what had begun as a solitary journey gained an unexpected companion. Esther proved herself not only knowledgeable of the paths, but also a loyal friend, the first Ezekiel had ever had. During the cold desert nights, they shared stories of their lives so different, and yet marked by the same feeling of not belonging. On the 20th day of the journey, as they approached the mountains more and more closely, a calamity befell them. A sandstorm, arisen seemingly from nowhere, enveloped them in a golden and suffocating whirlwind. Despite all efforts to orient themselves, they soon were completely lost. When the storm finally subsided, 2 days later, they found themselves in a totally unknown region. Even for Esther, Samuel's map had been damaged, becoming almost illegible. "Now what?" Ezekiel asked, despair threatening to overcome him again. "Now we move forward," Esther replied with a simplicity that hid her own concern. "All storms end eventually. All lost paths can be rediscovered." They wandered for 3 days, carefully rationing the little water they had managed to collect during the storm. It was then that they spotted in the distance what seemed to be a caravan. Colorful tents gracefully pitched against the cobalt blue sky. "Nomads," Esther whispered, immediately tensing her muscles. "We could be in danger. Some tribes are hostile to strangers." But before they could decide if they should approach the camp or go around it, they were spotted by sentinels. In a few minutes, they found themselves surrounded by men mounted on magnificent horses, their faces partially covered by blue turbans. Ezekiel, in an instinctive gesture, held the medallion tightly. Upon noticing this movement, the apparent leader of the group dismounted and approached, his eyes fixed on the object the boy held. "Where did you get that?" he asked in a language that, surprisingly, both Ezekiel and Esther could understand. With trembling hands, Ezekiel explained the origin of the family medallion. The man listened attentively, then turned to his companions and spoke in a different language, incomprehensible to the young people. A murmur of astonishment ran through the group. "My name is Ishmael," the man finally said, turning back to Ezekiel. "I am the leader of the tribe of the Sons of the Wind. This symbol you carry," he pointed to the medallion, "is sacred to us. It represents the union between heaven and earth, the same that your eyes seem to mirror." What followed was an extraordinary revelation. Ishmael's tribe had preserved over generations legends about the boy with different eyes, destined to reunite the divided peoples of the desert. They believed that when he appeared, he would bring with him the necessary knowledge to restore harmony between the nomadic tribes and the settled peoples, whose ancestral rivalry had devastated the region for centuries. "For generations, we have waited for you," Ishmael explained, as he led Ezekiel and Esther to the camp where they were received with respect and curiosity. That night, under the desert stars and around a crackling bonfire, Ezekiel shared his story, his mission, and his vision. He spoke of the special seeds mentioned in the ancient texts, which could transform the desert into fertile land. Ishmael listened attentively, his wrinkled face illuminated by the dancing flames. When Ezekiel finished, The old nomad was silent, for a long moment as if consulting an inner wisdom. "The seeds you seek exist," he finally said. "Our ancestors knew them, and we have kept some of them through the centuries. But they are not mere seeds. They are bearers of ancient knowledge, the knowledge of how to live in harmony with the earth, even in the most adverse conditions." In the days that followed, Ezekiel learned irrigation techniques developed by generations of nomads to maximize the use of the little water available in the desert. He learned about the capture of morning dew, how plants can be arranged to minimize evaporation, how certain herbs can help others survive in poor soils. "This is the true treasure," Ishmael explained, as he showed Ezekiel how to build a dew collection system, not just the seeds, but the knowledge of how to make them prosper. When it was time to leave, Ezekiel was no longer alone. Besides Esther, who remained steadfast by his side, representatives of the nomadic tribe decided to accompany him back to Stone Creek. They carried with them the precious seeds and, more importantly, the knowledge to transform the arid region into productive land. Exactly 40 days after his departure, as Samuel had prophesied, Ezekiel spotted on the horizon the familiar outlines of his native village. His heart beat erratically as he approached, uncertain about the reception he would find. The Stone Creek he found again, however, was very different from the one he had left. The situation had deteriorated drastically. The worst harvest in decades had led many families to abandon their homes in search of better conditions. Those who remained seemed shadows of themselves, thin and hopeless. Jerome, still leading the reduced community, received Ezekiel's group with a mix of surprise and distrust. The presence of the nomads, traditionally seen as enemies by the inhabitants of Stone Creek, only increased his apprehension. "You return bringing strangers to our door?" he questioned acidly. "What do you intend?" "I bring hope," Ezekiel replied with simple dignity. "Special seeds and knowledge on how to cultivate them, even in our ravaged land." A bitter laugh escaped Jerome's parched lips. "Hope? Look around you, boy. Half the village left. Those who remained are on the verge of starvation. And you show up with some seeds and empty promises." It was Jair, Jerome's son whom Ezekiel had saved during the storm, who intervened unexpectedly. "Father, what do we have to lose?" argued the young man, who seemed to have matured considerably in Ezekiel's absence. "Our traditional methods have failed. If there's even a chance." After a tense debate, Jerome yielded, more from the pressure of the remaining villagers than from his own conviction. Ezekiel and his companions would be permitted to implement their plan, but under constant surveillance. During 3 months of hard work, using the techniques learned from the nomads, the group led by Ezekiel built an elaborate system of irrigation, channels that captured morning dew and distributed it efficiently among the fields. The special seeds, smaller and more resilient than traditional varieties, were planted following specific patterns that allowed for maximizing the use of scarce water resources. The work was strenuous and often ridiculed by skeptics, led by Jerome. "They are wasting the little time we have left before we have to abandon this place," grumbled the village chief, watching with disdain the coordinated efforts of the increasingly large group of Ezekiel's supporters. But nature, as always, had the last word. When the first vigorous shoots began to emerge from the apparently sterile land, a murmur of hope ran through Stone Creek. And when the first fruits, larger, sweeter, and more nutritious than any others known in the region, were harvested, even the most skeptical had to admit that something extraordinary was happening. At the New Harvest Festival, which coincided with Ezekiel's 15th birthday, the village's transformation was visible. The fields previously parched now displayed various shades of green. Some families who had left began to return, attracted by news of the miraculous revitalization. It was in this moment of celebration that Samuel, gathering his last strength, rose from his sickbed to make a final revelation. With the help of Martha, who now openly showed her love for the son previously rejected, the old farmer attended the central square, where the entire community was gathered. In his trembling hands, he carried an ancient parchment, so fragile, it seemed it could disintegrate at the slightest touch. "Something everyone needs to hear," he announced, his voice surprisingly firm for someone so frail. "A prophecy guarded by my family for generations." An expectant silence fell upon the crowd as Samuel carefully unrolled the yellowed parchment. "When the boy with eyes that reflect heaven and earth unites the divided peoples, the land will flourish again," he read, the ancient words resonating like an echo of a past almost forgotten. "And he who was despised by men will be recognized as the chosen one to renew the covenant with the divine." Admiring glances turned to Ezekiel, who remained standing beside Esther, the young shepherd girl who had become his journey companion. "And gradually, something more. It's not just about me," the young man said, feeling the weight of those looks. "It's about all of us, about learning that our differences are not curses, but gifts destined for purposes greater than our immediate understanding." And so, as the sun set on the horizon of Stone Creek, tinting the revitalized fields gold, an unprecedented celebration united for the first time the nomadic tribes, the mountain shepherds, and the village farmers. Ancient feuds based on fear and scarcity began to give way to a new understanding of interdependence and mutual respect. Ezekiel, the boy with different eyes, once despised and feared, finally found his place, not as a leader seeking personal glory, but as a servant dedicated to a mission greater than himself. A link between different worlds, a meeting point between seemingly irreconcilable visions. A full year passed, and nature completed its cycle of transformation. The drought that once plagued the region gave way to a delicate balance, maintained thanks to the rediscovered ancient knowledge and the new techniques developed collaboratively by the now united peoples. On clear nights, Ezekiel still gazed at the stars, no longer with the solitary gaze of someone seeking answers. Now, he shared that moment with Esther and the many friends he had made on his journey. And when occasionally someone asked him about his past of rejection, he answered with a serene smile, "My scars taught me compassion, my loneliness taught me to value community, and my different eyes allowed me to see beyond appearances to the true heart of people and the land." And so, the boy who carried in his heterochromatic eyes the stigma of a supposed curse had become the man who carried in his gaze the blessing of a new perspective, the wisdom to perceive that, in the great tapestry of life, each unique and seemingly discordant thread is essential to the beauty and strength of the whole.